excerpt from the New Zealand's first National Adaptation Plan that was released last year. And so that plan signals a number of, quite helpful tools and changes to support our work at the local government level. I've just put little red boxes around the relevant actions for local government, and it is certainly not a comprehensive snapshot of everything in the National Adaptation Plan, but it includes some of the key things that we need to be aware of. I'm not going to take you through this whole slide today, but if you are interested, we can arrange another time, perhaps for a briefing from the Ministry for Environment to go through some of the changes. But just wanted to highlight that there are several policy changes and tools on the horizon for us that affect our work in our local climate adaptation planning. And so some of those things obviously include the RMA reform, but there are also changes to the science available. So NIWA are working hard at the moment on downscaling the last global assessment for New Zealand. They're working on a data portal and also updating the guidance that councils should be applying to local level adaptation planning, which is up here on the screen very helpfully. Thank you, Alison. So what we have presented to you within the roadmap is aligned to both the National Adaptation Plan and the Coastal Hazards guidance that was developed in 2017 but is currently being updated, and we're expecting changes later this year to that guidance document. Also, another factor that's been really influential for how we have shaped the roadmap is to respond to Wellingtonians' expectations and feelings around climate change impacts. We know that there's, growing anxiety around how our city is responding and how we as a community are going to adapt. What you can see there on the screen are some of the results from the latest Council's Residents Climate Monitoring Survey. The graph to the left shows you that over the last couple of years, we can see that over 80% of residents feel that the negative impacts of climate change are already beginning to show. While the graph on the right also shows that about 60% of the respondents show that they don't feel confident that enough is being done to prepare. So that really helps to, highlight the anxiety on this topic in the community.
So the tension we're really trying to navigate with this community engagement roadmap is between a lack of certainty in national government policy, a central government policy, I should say, and that they're not quite there yet, or not quite where we would want them to be. So they haven't released, for example, funding and financing mechanisms. So they haven't made plans for how managed retreat would be done in those circumstances where it should be done, how that would be done from a regulatory perspective, how it would be funded. And without that, it's very difficult for us to meaningfully help residents and know what our role is to play in that. But on the other hand, our residents are very concerned. It's already impacting us now, and they don't feel confident that we're doing enough. And when it's we, council, central government, in general, that enough is being done. So we want to craft opportunities for residents to feel heard and be heard, and be able to have a conversation with us about what they're worried about. But at the same time, there's some parts of this conversation that we can't have until we know what that central government policy is. Oh, yes, here's our slide on Bloomberg. Nice.
Yeah, so I guess we've included this as an example of some of the work that we're already doing to respond to that, I guess, the need in the community.
For more information.
Yeah, yeah. And I understand you've already been briefed on this relatively recently, but just wanted to highlight that this tool is a really great opportunity for us at Council. The way I see this is it will become a cornerstone of our community engagement work here in the city. It's going to help us to better explain in a much more compelling way climate change impacts and potentially what we can do about it as well.
Don't pay too much attention to where the lines are in that because it's uncalibrated data. What we wanted to do was show you kind of the fidelity of the digital twin in that it looks like a photo, like a photo from a drone of the actual city, and that we'll be able to superimpose upon that what flooding events or sea level rise looks like. So in theory, you would, as a resident, be able to zoom into your house and be able to change settings and see what the impacts over time might be at your location or to places in the city that are important to you and that you love. And that's much more powerful than giving somebody a 2D map with some static information on it. So I'm really excited about this, and Bloomberg clearly think it has real merit as well.
Absolutely. And what we're trying to do is to design this as closely with communities as possible. So we're designing this in parallel to the other work that's happening as part of the roadmap that we're presenting to you today.
We're also working in all of these pieces of work, making sure that mana whenua are up to date on this program of work and that they have the opportunity to be involved in Bloomberg and in any of the parts of the roadmap that they want to be involved in, subject to their capacity to be involved. But at the bare minimum, we're keeping them updated as to where we're at with it. So the roadmap itself, so we've discussed a little bit of why we want to do this, and the purpose of it is to support our most vulnerable communities to prepare for and adapt to the unavoidable local impacts of climate change in a fair and sustainable manner. And what we are trying to achieve with this roadmap is firstly that we are providing accessible information. So hence the digital twin and a plan for different ways of engaging with residents so that they can understand the information, ask questions about the information and really come to grips with the impacts in their local area. Our second goal is, following on from greater certainty of central government policy, be able to pilot local community adaptation planning processes, and in the later years of this plan, do actual co-creation of local climate adaptation plans. So that's when you're working with local communities on, for your particular set of houses, what is your vulnerability and over what period of time? What are the options that you have, like technical options? How do those sit with you socially, culturally, economically? Are we going to protect, relocate, accommodate? Those are the kinds of options that you have in an adaptation plan. So working that through with the local community and supporting them to make decisions about what is most meaningful to them and what they would like to see the future being. It's a long list of objectives there that I don't think we'll read.
No. I think you've covered most of them.
Most of it,
yeah.
Okay, good. But of course, we want to be inclusive and equitable. We want to ensure that we're improving safety in the city. We want to be in alignment with national and regional policy, with the principles of the treaty. So all of the things that you would expect to see, I would hope, are on that list.
And hopefully this slide might speak a little bit more to private and public assets and the connection between them. But really an important foundation of the roadmap is connecting what we're doing at the local community level with what we're doing for planning for climate change as a city as a whole. So it's really intentional that the framework that we're developing to apply climate change adaptation planning connects the dots between what is proposed for the planning process at the neighbourhood scale and how it interfaces back with our work citywide. One of the key, I guess, connectors in the process will be to build off Council's place-based approach to community engagement that is being developed. And so that will help us to connect the dots, both from a community engagement planning perspective, and then we can link it back to other planning processes that Council also has. So whether that's the LTP or our strategic asset management processes, there are a number of systems and processes that we need to connect behind the scenes.
So these are the 6 phases. Phases 1 and 2 really run concurrently. Scoping and groundwork we're already doing. But this refers to the work that supports community engagement. Phase 2 is engaging with the city to raise awareness. So these are the 2 activities that we propose to undertake in the next year using the Bloomberg funding and the Better Off funding, because one of the projects in the Better Off funding proposal was for community engagement around adaptation. Then we want to move into a planning phase for the later 3 phases. That's the actual local adaptation planning processes. So that's where you facilitate outputs of actual adaptation plans as opposed to engagement and awareness raising, if that makes sense. So we're going to take you through those 2 kind of phases, if you like. And this is how they fit together over time, and I'm going to skip this in the interest of time.
Yep.
So the scoping and groundwork includes technical investigations, impact assessments, partnership agreements, a whole lot of kind of background investigation work and policy work. The questions we had for you, I'm struggling to actually read.
I can read those, yeah. So the first question was building off some feedback that we've had in the past in terms of an interest to approach climate adaptation planning more from a regional perspective. And so getting a steer from you about how important tackling this from a regional approach is, so we can keep pursuing that. So we can get your feedback at the end for these questions as well, but just to prompt your thinking. And the second question there is really about the scope of the engagement and the roadmap, bearing in mind the breadth of risks that climate change brings to our city and the constraints that we have around funding. Most other councils are only doing coastal hazards focused programs that would be similar to what we're proposing, but we know that there is certainly interest to do more than just...
We have flooding and we have slips.
Yep. Yeah. So any thoughts on that?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this problem is coming at me from all angles because I'm talking to stuff about it at the moment as well. So Greater Wellington integration. So when I think of my award, we've got the Porirua Stream. That is a Whero Bay on crack, and it's not on the radar of council. Sorry. So how do we integrate Greater Wellington into this process, given that they govern the waterways, if we don't have them feeding in directly?
Yeah, so that is why we're doing the impact assessment from a regional perspective, and I think that's exactly Jamuna's point, is I think we would prefer to approach this from a regional perspective. Porirua Stream is high up our list, so internally, yes, it is. So thank you yep, good feedback.
Yes, talking about looking at things from a regional perspective, but you're wanting to engage with local communities. The problem with the regional perspective, so, I mean, Councillor McNulty is quite right in that we need to work across with regional council in particular, but there's also a few other agencies as well that are affected. Wellington Water springs to mind, and the new entity. So if it's going to be impacts going to be done at the regional level, I'm afraid I would say that local communities really want the impact assessed at the local level. So because in the end, that's what they can engage with. They can't engage, Glenside. Well, that's probably an exception that proves the rule. I'll say Johnsonville can't really engage on the wider Pororua stream issue. They're really sort of in the edge of it, and they're on the saddle, and so really what they want to know is impact on Johnsonville, and that goes towards scope as well. I think those two things are tied together because, Johnsonville isn't really so threatened with coastal issues. So, I think we can discuss that a bit later, but I want you to continue with your point. That's a bit of...
No, I think we would agree. It's definitely horses for courses, and part of phase 2, which is the public awareness raising, that is very much dependent on audience and location, what level of risk that particular part of a suburb, it's not even a whole suburb, but what level of risk a part of a suburb might be facing. So it's definitely that localisation is very important. I guess the regional partnership opportunity is where there are boundary issues, and also in terms of aligning approach, science mapping, making sure that we're being consistent as a region, particularly through the Regional Leadership Committee, because that is probably a really good vehicle for us, or is potentially a good vehicle for us in terms of accessing central government support or funding, and the influence that regional growth framework has, which has very specific pieces in it around where houses should or shouldn't be built. At the very least, we would want to stay influencing the regional point of view, and there's an extent to which we can draw back from the region, insights, consistency, and then we need to localise it. Yep.
I was the chair, but just trying to put my hand up so it's fair. People can see. I have my hand up. I think for me, then urgency needs to come into this equation as well, and so I'm sure you can appreciate that if anything more weird and wonderful happened on the South Coast on my watch, I'd feel very sick. I know we've got Mr. Doyle in the room today, but there's a very live, not saying that slips aren't, but just that is top of mind as a councillor, that we're progressing before something happens to us, rather than us starting to make moves toward how we can do what we need to do, or make a collective decision on doing what we need to do.
Yep, and this is the issue around, as I've previously stated in some of these workshops, adaptation comes down to two key issues: who decides and who pays. The who decides is that you want to be giving voice and decision-making ability and agency to communities and to mana whenua. So from a who decides perspective, a lot of thought Jamuna has put in, and other councils have put in around the country around how you design processes that genuinely give local communities agency in these sorts of processes. So that's the first. The second, on who pays. Local government cannot afford to protect private property or to fund adaptation. There's not enough money, and that is a position held by Local Government New Zealand, and is a position held by most councils up and down the country. It's a very high value of assets at risk, and it is a national problem around how accommodation of water or extreme flooding events, extreme weather events will be paid for, or response to emergencies. Like if you think about the impacts of Cyclone Gabriel, it will be paid for out of central government, not by local councils. You know, it's shared. There is no clarity yet from central government as to what that share is, what local government's contribution is, and how much of that cost, because all of the options on an adaptation pathway have cost, be it accommodating water, relocating away from water, or defending against water. All of those options come with cost, and there is no clarity as to how much of that cost should be borne by the local ratepayer, the private property owner, the insurance company, or the central government funds. And without that clarity, it's very easy to get into a position where you've run a community process that has raised expectations of investment, and you need a clear framework for how that investment decision will be made and who is paying that money. So the question of who pays is really difficult and challenging.
So just to carry on, and then I'll go to Diane, and just acknowledging your...
Several more slides.
Okay.
And so what we have basically designed is, yes, we want to do that local adaptation planning that would define a costed pathway of activities over time, but we want to wait until central government policy has been developed, and that is imminent. It's like a year away. Yep. In the meantime, we don't want to be silent. You know, communities are concerned. They need more information than they currently have. While we publish maps of hazards in the district plan, not a lot of residents look at the district plan unless they're buying a house. So there's a definite need for more information and an opportunity for residents to be heard and listened to, and for us to start this conversation, even if we don't have the clarity and certainty around investment.
Thank you. Just to answer your questions, I think Diane had a contribution, but do you want us to come back if we have further thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I'm just conscious we only have another 20 minutes, so I want to... Okay, because I want to get a proper discussion around this public education piece of the plan for the next year with the DIA money, and then a good discussion of the local adaptation planning piece between 24 and 27.
Just when you're asking questions around the scope of the program, and there's two things I'd like to understand, to answer me now, and this is my question about costs. We've got $3 million. How are you divvying it up in these different parts of the phases, and how will you know what you're on track for achieving the objectives? So if I take the scope and if you just kept it to Wellington City, what are the key areas that you're intending to go out to? Is it suburb by suburb? Is it ward by ward? Just being able to get a better understanding. And look, and all the pictures are all about coastal, and I appreciate the wards that have got a coastal area. And look, we've got Makara, but that went through a process which didn't really end up that well, and I think you've learned from that. But we've got a lot of slips. It's a real big issue, but it's also about council's input into this. Council owns a lot of the land as well, or joining land. And also, I'm really interested in terms of scope, how you bring in our urban development plans. Because when we put in a lot more housing or buildings or construction, whatever it might well be, and we've got a lot more hard services, where does that water go, and how are we dealing with that? So I didn't really see that when you're talking about your scope and how that would, because I think your problem can be as big as you want it to be, obviously, or what we've got to solve. But how do we actually? How can I tell that you're going to be able to go out to Whare Bay, and what are you going to actually do with them? I just really, I can't picture it yet, and I can picture it through the slides. So if you could look at that,
Let's get into the next set of slides. Because I think it will answer some of your questions, and then I'd be interested in what you would still like information on. From a public education perspective, our plan is to firstly seek to understand what the community want and need from us. I think Eugene has done a great job of organising, forums and giving us really clear guidance on what the coastal communities that he's involved with want and need, and what kind of information they'd like to know more about, and what kind of conversation they want to have. But to your point, Diane, there are other communities. There's Porirua stream flooding issues, there's slip issues. So being able to have those, find out from those communities what they are most concerned about, what they would like to discuss, is our first step. And then secondly, to then tailor the education sessions around those needs, audiences, channels, tactics, so that we're reaching the people that want to be reached. We want to not focus solely on what the impacts are, but also how communities could respond to climate change. But that's really going to come through from our research and from what we find out. And we also wanted to note that there are several complementary engagements also going on with communities. So we've got the City in Transition work, talking to the city about how we're responding, creating the city of impact through a whole variety of infrastructure projects, some of which are Wellington Water digging up the pipes, some of which are transport related. We have the Bloomberg project, and there are a range of other ones. So that's our kind of plan for developing these, this public education program, is to follow these steps. First, build relationships with communities. And this is going to be a long-term relationship. It's on this topic. It's not a short kind of fly-in, fly-out. So really building those relationships first and starting in a place of trust is really important. Then identifying what they need and how, preparing those engagements and then rolling them out. That could involve in-person workshops, attending existing community group meetings, setting up community pop-ups at various community events, doing online workshops, doing online, posting more information online. So it's kind of a bit of horses for courses in terms of format. And we're getting a lot of really great input from the engagement team at Council around sort of what things work and what things don't, and how to find out what might be appropriate. We've had a good think about potential audiences, and Diane, the climate vulnerable communities, it's other sorts of hazards, not coastal hazards, other hazards, and those, the communities that are impacted by those. And what we were interested in your feedback on for this one was, are there any groups that you feel are missing from this list that you think are super obvious? And do you have any feedback on the priority order of these groups, keeping in mind we probably can't talk to everybody at once? So who do you think we should go to talk to first? Yes. Who would you like us to go talk to first? Yep. Okay. Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So yes, please feel free to, because we had originally scheduled this for 2 hours and it got squashed for reasons beyond our control. So feel free to write us emails and send us, your detailed thoughts on these slides afterwards, so that we can incorporate that into the paper at the end of April.
So I would, partly reinforce that just by saying that in terms of a cascade into breaking up a bit, breaking up initially into a set of wards, and engaging at that level, because each ward has actually got a lot of people, but you at least have, some hopefully connected sort of people you can help guide you into the next level.
Yep, thank you. So that's kind of that's the end of my slides on that first phase, which is public education, hearing from residents, providing them with more information, and we're planning to run that until after the next election. and after the Climate Change Adaptation Act exists in the world. It doesn't even have to be final. We just have to know what's in it, and we currently don't. And we are expecting that to be shortly after the next election, provided there's no change in government. But even with a change of government, I would expect that something similar would need to be proposed by the next government in response to Cyclone Gabrielle. Then, following that level of certainty after the general election and clarity in national policy context, we can then enter the phase of working with those communities that we've developed those trusting relationships with on local adaptation plans, following the MFE guidance on how you have those conversations with local communities, which has a really great process to follow that's considered best practice in how this works. So the first thing we would do is public consultation on what that looks like, because there are questions around how you structure community input and decision-making powers into those local adaptation plans. And we would want community feedback as to whether they felt those structures would work, and also whether those structures would work for mana whenua, and whether we're getting it right in terms of how to give effect to the partnership and the treaty in those local adaptation plans. Then once we've gone to public consultation and approved a plan for that, then we would roll it out, piloting first with the most high priority communities, feeding that into council decision making, and then a phase of sort of review. Obviously those things kind of happen concurrently, with communities starting into that process at different times. But that's sort of the way it's structured. So that's it. What do you think?
I've got Iona and then Terry.
First of all, thank you for all your great work, because we knew it was urgent, so I really appreciate it. First question is just following on from Laurie. Given what we are now seeing, is your thinking changing about how urgent it is? Because you'll remember that I deliberately did this. By 2030, we were supposed to have made some major cuts in our emissions. Now the weather events are coming on, are you changing your views about that we need to move quicker, even quicker?
Are you talking about mitigation or adaptation?
Now, and actually, I'll bring that up next. So I'll just do my questions because some of them are related. I actually don't accept necessarily that distinction between mitigation and adaptation, because I actually think, and to my lovely friends on the other side of the table, we get pushed back on cycleways. Actually, I think cycleways are an adaptation method just as much as they're a mitigation one, right? You know, with higher. So I just, that would actually be one. I think this is very serious. Okay, so just actually. And I think we need to indicate that. Two, I don't want such a hard distinction between those two, because I think they're more complex. I don't, and quite strongly do not agree around your point that you're going to be able to demark private and public property. I just don't think it works that way. It's too interconnected. And unusually for me, my last point, I'm usually a bottom-up kind of person, but I think if we go out and go, oh, we want to know what you need and what you think, I think that's actually going to be a bit scary for people. I think they want to know that local government and central government and business have got their backs, because it is extremely scary if you are teetering on a cliff. Sorry, Laurie, I think slips are just as bad if you take them at their worst point as sea level rise. That's just not reassuring. There's got to be some leadership. So those are my 4 bits of feedback.
Okay, thank you. A couple of thoughts. I kind of see this as a fence at the top of the cliff, the steepness of the cliff, and then the ambulance at the bottom. So the ambulance at the bottom being disaster response that swings into gear when you've fallen down the cliff. You can do some adaptation of making the cliff less cliffy, more hilly, a rope ladder on it, set of steps, you know, so you can invest in how elegantly you fall down the cliff, and you can also invest in better fencing at the top of the cliff. So for me,
there in the first place. And I think Diane's
You
point
can move
was
back from the cliff.
Well,
So
to be careful.
the fence building for us is city shaping and making our city as zero carbon as quickly as possible. And that is the essence of Te Atakura, is to both pay attention to reducing emissions and to pay attention to how we accommodate extreme weather that we know will come regardless of how fast or hard we cut emissions. So both of those things have to be true at the same time. And I think this council has really strong plans on carbon reduction around how we've shaped the city, the spatial plan, building urban density, creating a zero carbon transport system. Those things are fundamental to reducing the risk of extreme weather. And then when the extreme weather comes here, we need to work on how we reduce the impact, so how vulnerable we are to that impact. So I do think those two things are related, and I agree with you. One of the pieces around this public education, I'm reasonably sure, but we want to do some research first, that communities are going to want to discuss all sides of the climate action topic at the same time. I noted when we went to the forum that Eugene helped organise, one of the first questions from an audience member was, I want to know what I can do. I recycle, what else can I do? I was like, for a start, a lot more than recycling. But it did show me that there's a desire to contribute to preventing the problem, and that people really don't know what to do and how to contribute on that front. So I'm expecting that these conversations will cover risks and impacts, but also what does it mean to try to respond as a city to climate change? What does that mean for us? Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you. Terry, then Tony.
Kia ora. This looks like such exciting work, and just to be able to watch it come to life over the last few years as well. My feedback is mainly around when we go to community and we're talking about council responding through Te Atakura and waiting on central government for their piece of legislation to really home in on tūpiki order as our guiding strategic governance document, because consistently I'll see maybe once we get down to the public engagement start of things, if we don't first start from the place of tūpiki order, then we kind of lose that, even if we are making an active effort to engage with mana whenua. And then, yeah, it's like just kind of, I'm a big believer that once you get to kind of know the heritage and history of where you grow up and where you're living and your impact, then we will be able to holistically look better at a whole of community approach. Like, it's the example of if I, like in Melrose, which is like the hills of Lao Bay, even if I recycle and I have predator-free traps, but if I'm not maintaining that relationship, if I subdivide the back of my property and I don't take into account the why and the water, then it's becomes more difficult. And like with the maps, the overlays that you have, talking about like historic places and ancestral places and, you know, those cultural waypoints and the waypoints of nature as well, which might sound a bit hippie to my colleagues, but like I will be able to better understand the maunga if I look around, you know, what other populations, you hear me? Yeah.
That's good. Yep, that's great feedback. Thank you.
And like, yeah, and then to Tony, I tautoko Tony's point about chatting to EMs about who are the community leaders, because I know that I've got like 10 predator-free people that can already start that korero, you know. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Tony and then Diane.
Yes. Coming at this slightly differently, I think. Putting my project management hat on, even though it's a bit worn. I took from you first of all, about this is about climate adaptation. It's about giving people a focus on protecting private property, okay? And out of all of that, what I really picked up is having a community climate adaptation plan. Well, in fact, you had plans, so obviously there's going to be several, and working with the local community. And I actually think that's the key outcome goal. It's not actually about doing the adaptation. people can't actually do the adaptation unless they are part of a plan, because one individual property owner can't adapt to protect themselves. So when you're talking about, for example, on the coastal thing, you may have managed retreat, but that really needs to be a community in terms of the group of the local residents agreement. You can't sort of do it by democracy and majority rules, and then, maybe you have to do it that way, but you have to have, get a really close engagement. It's a big decision, whether you try and put in a seawall or not. And of course, you're saying also you're trying to coordinate people who in the end are going to pay, because we ain't paying. Now, there may be some central government contribution, there may be some wider community contribution. That's part of the plan you've got to work out. So when Terry says, it sounds like exciting work, yes, to me, it sounds like damn hard work working with local communities in terms of what you're doing.
Yep.
I wanted to pick up on three other points. Urgency. So I think that there is some areas which require some urgency, but I also think there's some areas where the community is not even ready for this. And I also believe that you can't turn up and just say there's a problem without giving them some very clear information around what the nature of the problem is for them, which goes towards having a set of local impact statements, which is why I made the comment earlier. In the end, you're going to have them, and because the community will make you have them. You can have the best regional plan you like, and you're going to turn up at Johnsonville and Tawa, and they're going to say, well, what about this? What are we going to do about the bridge and across the Tawa Stream? Is that impacted? Are we going to have to replace it? And you might say, well, unless you can answer that question, they can't engage. So I think you do need, that's one of the early outcomes. I don't think you can really engage with any community until you've actually got that initial impact assessment. My other feedback, and because, people in communities are where, got to take them where they are now, and they're often very different. So my strong advice is really that you should try and phase it. Sure, deal with the communities that are seeing it right in front of them, but don't necessarily rush it to try and get it completed by a day. Put the communities in order, tell them there's an order, tell them you're further down the queue because your initial assessment isn't that it's going to, stuff's going to happen tomorrow. There might be slip risks in Nio, but, a Whāwhā Bay first.
Yeah.
Because they need a plan. And focus very much on when you go to them, you say, we're going to go and work with you to come up with a plan for your community. Because the other thing which I don't think has been quite twigged to, doesn't come through your strategy, and that is different communities may come up with different solutions. And that's where the regional planning may, you may have managed retreat in a Whāwhā Bay, but you might put a seawall up in Warsaw Bay, because that's what the community has decided they're going to do. And so, working on the private property side means that they actually have to come up with the plan more than you, because so our role is to guide the process and reflect back to them what they need, more than telling them what they have to do.
Yep, I agree.
Give them the information. Yeah, so that's my feedback.
Yep, thank you.
Phase the thing.
Yep, thanks.
Can I just check, has anyone got 10 minutes over that they can go for this workshop? I think, is that possible? DM Services? Are you okay with if we do that?
We do have youth council in here at 4, but 10 minutes is fine.
10 minutes, thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, Tony, Diane.
Thanks. Really just following on from Tony as well, probably some of the stuff that Ina talked about. I think if you trial a couple of different types of communities first, so it might be a Whāwhā Bay and it might be somewhere, that has more of a slip issue, that then if you trial it out and see how you can then adapt to other communities, it might save some planning. I think you need to engage with councillors right up front. We know our communities. I'm not saying we know everything, but we know a lot of the people. We know a lot of the different groups, but we also know a lot of the challenges and the issues, and what things may come at you at left field. So it might be things that you may not. It's not in this climate adaptation thing, but things that we know the community's worried about, and they'll hook those in, or they'll try, so we can help you on that.
Thank you.
So that's why you need to, if you see us first. And, just think about the elephant in the room, which we haven't touched on, and that's buses. And I say buses because that's what a lot of people talk to me about. Why aren't that's where we talked about cycleways, but actually buses are going to actually get more of a change in transport mode than anything else. And so I think you just got to think about that. And I
Constantly prepared for bus questions.
Yes. And then I think also, and just reiterating what Iona said, is I think you've got to, don't go out with this big, what you tell us. You have to have some sort of structure. Otherwise, it will be a never-ending piece of string.
Yep.
And that's why I'd really like to see, what are you going to be, what will we see in 6 months' time? Will you have talked to 3 communities or 2? Where will you be on that journey? That's what I'd really like to see from this.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Matthews. Thank you, Diane.
Yeah, just very quickly, I guess I think the safety aspect is a really important for different communities, because that is, where people will start to be concerned about, and so I think that, does, kind of lead to that kind of hierarchy which you had about, coastal communities. And I think that coastal and slips, I think those can be quite different conversations, and, maybe not as kind of clear cut on that issue of adaptation, there not being able to be, individual things you can do to in an adaptation sense at this point. So, yeah, I think I just wanted to kind of make that point that might be quite a different kind of conversation. They're both very important, but I think the sort of safety lens is a really important kind of opening one, and one that we, any kind of education that we're doing at this point, we have to have that kind of focus. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you. Rebecca. Ben?
Yeah, just 2 things on engagement. I think the LTP's got quite a good model in there that could be replicated, because I'd probably put this on a similar level of importance. I think direct mail needs to be a consideration, not to everyone, but into some of those key areas, because you can yell from the rooftops and put it out on social and digital and all as you like, but you will need to physically engage some people in those critical communities. And I'll actually say residents associations, they do represent the landed gentry quite well, and they are a portion here of the community impacted, so I would actually say they're probably quite a good part of the consultation. But that LTP program is pretty comprehensive. I just think it needs that direct mail element or layer sitting over it, and some key stakeholders too.
Kia ora, thanks, Ben. Nureddin.
One thing I really liked is how you said localized approach, which is very important. And from my discussion and engagement with community, what I understand is how much they know and exactly what they're looking for, inviting scientists. I think, Eugene, you did an amazing job in this area, and the whole community really appreciate your job. And I also appreciate how you're engaging with people like Eugene, the community leaders, and bringing them into the table and working with them. Those are, I think, people previously asking who are those leaders. I think that one of them is sitting with us now. So we need to be working with those people, and they know exactly what they're doing. And regards to the holistic approach, the cycle lane and the bus lanes, what I would say to my colleagues is tomorrow there is a paper coming in support of dedicated bus lanes. And I hope we're all going to support that. So I think this is going to address it. And thank you so much.
Yeah. And just some feedback from me. Well, questions really. I guess my question is 2 questions that relate. How progressive are we as a council around the motu having this conversation? And would that lead to some support from government? I know that we've got some funding from them, but actually, how do we integrate this for them to help them speed up their processes? Is it a trial, something that could be useful to them?
Jamona and I are attempting to influence MFE officials on a reasonably regular basis.
Good.
Feel free to reach out.
Do your own bit.
To any central government MPs you have a relationship with and ask them where the climate change adaptation is at and when they might be putting it forward. So yeah, we do regularly kind of have those conversations. Good. And yes, we are ushering them on.
We're trying.
We're trying. Yeah. But yes, good feedback.
Good.
We'll try harder.
So one more from Tony, and then maybe we'll just have a wrap up and next steps. I did text Eugene. Eugene, do you have any questions? I was saying.
I actually appreciate it. A private asset is to protect the public asset because it goes sea, beach, footpath, road, houses. So I think that, in a way, communities would sort of put that all together. I do totally agree with what you. I think a number of you said that actually you don't want to go blurting into communities and have conversations about what do you feel, what do you want, all of that. Before you go, here's the impact assessments, and I can tell you, in our coastal communities and climate change, the number one thing we want are those localised impact assessments, because you can't really have a high quality conversation until you have a better sense of what's coming your way. So I just tautoko all those comments there. And I'll wrap now if you like. I've got lots to say, but I'll wrap. I do think you need to crack on. And you guys have been great. We've really appreciated the engagement with you. But I think we need to get some of these processes nutting out how we do it together. Oh yeah, and one thing actually is how you aggregate communities. I think an efficient way for you to deal with these things is actually to, like for example, our 1-4C coastal communities and climate change were brought together a number of communities, Breaker Bay, Mile Point, Lyall Bay, Houghton Bay, O'Fero Bay, and that's actually quite a cool way to group it. So there you've got coastal. I'd suggest you've also got inner city. That's a hugely important one, obviously. And then I think like with Tony and the Wastedown, Nio, Kandala, the hillsides and all of that. I mean, you're not the only people with hills, but I mean, that could be another way to usefully group. Yeah, because actually, from what I understand from the science, those heavy water impacts, landslides, etc., just appreciate all your support, Laurie, too, for us coastal people. That's really appreciated. But I do know those slips are going to be a big deal.
Yeah. Thank you, Eugene. Great to have you here today.
Awesome.
Appreciate it. One more from Tony.
Sorry, Tim. Thank you for another bite of the cherry. I thought, Ben, thank you for everyone's contribution. It's been very, very interesting. I thought Ben's insight around direct mail is really important, because in the end we're talking about property owners. I just add in, we also want to target the landlords, because a lot of renters they won't really see it as their issue. So talking to renters about such a long-term thing, protecting the asset which they don't own, is so just that side of things. And maybe the database that we have could be enhanced to try and start collecting more landlord addresses and such like, as in terms of process, may help do that connection. And so lastly, the other thing is just remember that this is a big project. This is why I come to council, is to do this sort of stuff. Okay, so you've got a lot of support from councillors. It's one of the reasons why I encourage you to keep us involved as a conduit. And the other thing is, how do you eat an elephant?
One bite
at a time. So just. So start knowing it's a marathon. I think you do need to start early, but I don't think you need to rush. I think it's better that when you turn up to the community that has outlined, that you are prepared. And so as you go, don't try and deal with the whole city. Deal with the communities you need to engage with. Thanks.
Jamuna's plan is to look at the highest risk communities first and work out from there. So I think that helps in terms of a balance between urgency and not being able to reach everybody at the same time.
Yeah.
And I'm also really looking forward to Bloomberg to being able to reach everybody all at once without us having to talk to them personally.
Good. Thanks, Tony. That was really nice to wrap up on. So, right, so next steps, when do we see you next?
You will see us at EIC on is it the 27th of April?
Yes, 27th. Yep.
Yeah, so we will do our best to reflect back your feedback and your key points and what you wanted more information on in the paper. The roadmap will be pretty much what you've seen, and it will be an appendix to that paper.
Great.
If that sounds all right.
Yeah, I'm just observing that as well. It might be good to just have an open session for an hour where a drop-in.
Okay.
It'd be really good. And then that way people that have got questions can...
After the paper or before the paper? Before, okay.
Oh, during, so the week that it's out.
Ah, okay. Yep, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll let Liam, someone manage that. Thank you.
He'll
thank
just delegate it back to me.
Yeah. Yeah, on behalf of all of us, thank you. Really great update and most welcomed. So thank you.
Thank you for your
really
great
good
feedback.
news.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah, good. Yeah.